How often have you thought that you can't find the time for that side hustle, project, or even hobby that you would love to spend more time on? Today, I want to talk about 3 time wasters that could gain you an extra 40 hours in your week. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. We've all heard the saying that everyone has the same 24 hours in a day. So, how is it that some people seem to be able to use that 24 hours so much better than others? And for me, I've realized that this probably comes down to how they are maximizing these little pockets of time that other people maybe aren't. This idea of the compound effect of time over the long term was really highlighted to me when I read Stephen Pressfield's book, Put Your Ass Where Your Heart Wants to Be. And in it, he talks about just 1 hour a day over the course of a year, equating to the equivalent of 9 40-hour work weeks. So it really got me thinking about where these little pockets of time could be, because for some of us, even finding 1 hour a day can actually be the challenge. So today I want to talk about the 3 areas that I have found through research could be where these little pockets of time might be hiding. The first is television watching, and these numbers added up are quite eye-watering when you think about this over the long term of a year. So most of the research across Australia and the US, for example, shows that the average person watches roughly 2.5 to 3 hours of television a day. So if we extrapolate this out, that means that that is the annual equivalent of 910 hours at the lower end of that equation, which then equals, if you're thinking about a 40-hour work week, so using that Stephen Pressfield sort of mindset, that equals 23 40-hour work weeks. So just those couple of hours that you're spending on watching TV could be the equivalent of 23 work weeks. And to put that in perspective, if you haven't already done that math, 23 work weeks is nearly the equivalent of half of an entire year. So 26 weeks would be half of a year. So that is a huge amount of time when you think about it in that way. And that's not to say that you shouldn't be watching any TV. I know for so many of us, TV is that one place that you can switch off and wind down, but it's just a way to show you where some of those hours might be hiding. So maybe even if you took just one of those hours or half an hour or anything that you can from that space and reallocated it to something that you want to work on, or that hobby that you want to have, or even just spending time with family that isn't in front of the TV or friends, then that could also be potentially more valuable to you if that is a part of your priorities. The second place that you could be wasting a stunning amount of time is social media, and you may not realize that it is as high as it is. So for the typical working age internet user, it's said that we use social media for about 2.5 hours a day, which means that those numbers then are the equivalent as well of what we talked about with TV. So if you extend that out over a week, that is the equivalent of 17.5 hours. That adds up to 910 hours over a year, and you again have another 23 work week equivalent. So if you add up just those 2 things that we have talked about already in terms of television watching and social media scrolling, then that means that we are at 46 40-hour work weeks. Now in Australia, most people will work 48 weeks of the year. If they are working for someone else and they have annual leave, let's say 4 weeks, then they're working 48 weeks roughly on average, which means that 46 work weeks is almost the annual equivalent of a full working year spent scrolling social media and watching TV. It's quite mind-blowing when you actually think about it in that way, just how those little numbers can add up over the long term. That watching television and scrolling social media could be the equivalent of another full-time job. But I also understand that social media for most of us is just a part of our lives, and we might use it to keep in touch with people, we might use it for our work, and it's not something that most of us necessarily want to completely stop using. But that is where I found the book Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport to be a really interesting concept, because he talks about leveraging social media to the extent that you need it. So to use it as much as you possibly need to optimize what you are getting out of it, but to not use it absolutely any more than that. So it's essentially trying to flip the script on social media companies who are spending billions and billions of dollars to capture your attention and to keep you on social media platforms because they profit from your attention. And it's trying to use all of the wonderful things that social media has to offer to you and to leverage that to its full extent, but not actually going past that at all. So you're using social media, but you're using it in a minimalist and really intentional way. So to bring this back to how I've personally adopted this idea of digital minimalism, outside of the 2 episodes that I publish on my YouTube channel and my podcast, I also publish to LinkedIn twice a week as well. I will publish an article on LinkedIn, but I actually use the platform very rarely now. So I will go onto the platform to share the articles that I want to publish. At most, I might scroll for a minute, sometimes even seconds. Sometimes I like to just ignore the feed entirely if I don't want to get stuck in that scrolling trap. But to an outside person, it might look like I use the platform a lot. But the beauty of the way that your feed works is that the most relevant content is going to be one of the first posts on your LinkedIn profile. So you don't have to necessarily get stuck in this scrolling. And it just takes a little bit of discipline, because it is so hard to stop scrolling, to just make sure that you are taking that minimalist approach. But that is the way that I've adopted it, in terms of I really want to use LinkedIn. I talk about LinkedIn a lot on this platform. I see a lot of value in LinkedIn as to what it has to offer, but I also just don't want to get stuck in this trap of constantly watching what other people are doing. I want to make sure that I'm using that platform in a way that is going to have the highest return on investment for me. And this idea of digital minimalism doesn't need to just apply to work in terms of creating content. It could just be really paying attention to that intentional part of the concept and how you're using social media intentionally. I, for example, as I talk about on this channel a lot, I'm a huge fan of Pinterest, and I've really used it to refine a lot of my goals, my hobbies, my interests, and I use it for research, I use it for creativity, and I personally don't feel any sort of wasted time when I am actually on Pinterest, because I'm using it so intentionally to align with my goals and to align with my interests. So that is just a way that you can think about, if you don't want to cut social media out of your life, how you can actually still do those things, still wind down, still relax, but try and divert it into a little bit more of an intentional practice for whatever it is that you are trying to achieve or whatever it is that you are interested in. And the number 3 time waster is your commute. So in Australia, there was a report that came out a few years ago that showed that the average commute is 54 minutes a day. By my calculations, if I was to extend that out to what that means for the average full-time worker in a week, then that would mean that they are commuting for 270 minutes or 4.5 hours a week, which is the annual equivalent of 216 hours. And I am only basing that on a 48-week year, which is the equivalent of 5 40-hour work weeks that is spent on the average commute. Now, your commute is probably something that you aren't actually able to get out of as a part of your job, but this is an opportunity for you to think about how you are using that time. For example, the legendary Zig Ziglar coined the term automobile university. So how are you turning that opportunity that you have in your commute for a time that you can, for example, switch on a podcast that is in your field of interest or in a hobby that you would love to learn more about? How are you, instead of just listening to usually pointless radio banter, actually engaging with something that is related to something that you are particularly interested in? So think about how you can still engage in that activity, but again, leverage it to optimize the amount of time that you have there, the 5 weeks that you have available commuting, and all of the things that you could potentially learn in that time. Because as a side note to that, remember that your commute also costs you money. So in Australia, for example, the average cost of getting from A to B for your work was said to be $4,000 annually. So that would be like $20 a day that you spend commuting. So if your commute is costing you both time and money, you really want to make sure that it's not just this dead space in your day and you are using it to get the most out of it as well. And that doesn't need to necessarily always be a learning activity or something that is going to align with your goals. It could also relate to your relationship. So maybe that's the time that you spend the time calling a friend or a family member and catching up with them. Of course, driving safely while you are doing that and sticking to all of the rules in that as well. But I used to always find this a really nice part of my commute, was just having that opportunity to reconnect with people in that time. And I found that so much more valuable than listening to the radio or anything else that I could have done in that time as well. So it's just an idea to think about how you could use that opportunity a little bit more to maybe advance some of your priorities too. If you add up just those 3 time wasters that we have talked about today, so your television watching, your social media scrolling, and your commute, then that adds up to approximately a 52-week work week equivalent. So ask yourself if you really don't have the time or if you could just be using it better. If you want some ideas on the habits that could potentially be keeping you stuck, then check out my previous episodes on this topic. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.